We'll just give everybody a couple more minutes because I think we've all been keen. We've got some attendees joining already, but we're just a couple of minutes off 6 o'clock, so we'll give people a bit more time.
Holly, can you hear me? Yeah, good.
Yeah, that's fine. Great. Well, I think we'll make a start. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this evening for our webinar on biodiversity net gain. To start with just a little bit of housekeeping. As attendees, you're all muted as a default. So if you'd like to ask a question as we go along, please put that in the chat function and we'll pick those up and come to those at the end. We're going to have a Q&A after the presentations. And thank you also to everybody who has already submitted a question when you registered. We've tried to address some of those in our presentations already, and we'll pick up a few more of them at the end as well. I'm joined this evening by a fantastic panel who are all specialists on biodiversity net gain in their respective fields. So I will be presenting first, and then I'll be followed by Josie Edwards from Micklemore's, who'll be taking us through the legislation and the legal agreements that will underpin biodiversity net gain. Heather Overhead and Anthony Greeley from Litchfields will provide some of the insight into the impact of BNG on the planning process and the challenges it presents for developers and planners. And last but not least, we'll have Guy Horswell from Taylor Wimpey, who's going to give us their perspective on BNG delivery and how solutions can be found on or off-site. At the end of all the presentations, we'll have some time for questions, and we also have hopefully a couple of attendees from local planning authorities who've indicated that they might be willing to pick up a few questions at the end. So if you are those people, please feel free to stick your hands up if you want to come in on the Q&A, and I can unmute you and we can bring you into that Q&A. So to start off with, I'm going to just give an introduction to the basic principles of biodiversity net gain, because there might be a few of you who aren't familiar with it or maybe just would like a refresher. So the principle of biodiversity net gain requires developers to not just offset any biodiversity that's lost as a consequence of development, but also to deliver a net gain in biodiversity of at least 10%. And that's compared to the pre-development baseline, so what was there before the development took place. It became mandatory for all major developments on the 12th of February this year, and for small sites, it'll come into force at the start of April. The value of the habitat for biodiversity net gain purposes is worked out using a tool called the biodiversity metric that DEFRA have developed. And that looks at a number of different factors, such as the type of habitat that's present, the condition of that habitat, the extent, so the acreage, and other factors such as how rare or how difficult it is to recreate that habitat, whether it's identified in a local strategy, that kind of thing. So that metric then tells you how many biodiversity units will be available on that site. So it looks at the baseline first of all, and then it looks at what might be there after you have developed the site or after you have undertaken some habitat creation or restoration, and tells you what uplift in biodiversity value might be delivered. So it's a tool that can be used both by developers and by landowners looking to scope out potential BNG projects. The developer is expected to avoid damage first and foremost, and to keep habitats on site where they can. And if they can't do that, then they can look to deliver their net gain off-site. And off-site just means anywhere outside of the red line boundary of the development itself. This could create opportunities for farmers and landowners, as they might be able to be paid to deliver habitat restoration or creation projects that will generate these biodiversity gains that developers need. Developers are also incentivized to deliver net gain within the same local authority area or national character area as a first preference. Sometimes local planning authorities might also make their own requirements about how close to the development site the habitat project has to be, but that's likely to vary a bit between different regions. If the developer can't find a way to deliver BNG on site or off site, they can purchase units from DEFRA, and they're called statutory credits, and they'll be available from DEFRA as a last resort. So they're meant to be able to demonstrate that they've tried other means before they go to DEFRA for those credits. Some key things to note about BNG from a landowner's perspective is that projects must be secured for a minimum of 30 years. So that is a really long-term commitment, and it's something that might well affect future generations or future landowners. And Josie will pick up on that a little bit more in a moment. At the moment, the market for biodiversity units is still quite uncertain. So we can't say for sure what the demand will be or what the price per unit might be as the market develops. And that is a little bit of a challenge because one of the questions that we get asked quite a lot about biodiversity net gain, understandably, is what is BNG worth? And it makes this quite a difficult question to answer. Supply and demand as well is likely to vary quite a lot regionally. So that's another challenge in kind of looking to assess the financial potential of some of these projects. The gross income that you might receive might be quite significant, and you might have seen some big figures quoted in the press or people talking about them. But it's really important to remember that these are the total payment across a 30-year project. So it's important to take costs into account. Obviously, there's likely to be some significant costs depending on your choice of habitat that you might be creating. And it's also really important to break that income down to a kind of per hectare annual basis so that you can properly compare it with other land uses as well. The project might also well have an impact on the capital value of the land, and there'll of course be tax to pay as well. So there's lots of different things to take into consideration rather than just looking at those headline figures. There was also quite a bit of media attention last year when the statutory credit prices were announced. So that's those prices for the units that DEFRA might provide as a last resort. And again, there were some big figures quoted, but those prices are set to be intentionally uncompetitive because they're meant to deter developers from going down that route if they can avoid it. We also get asked a lot, well, what does a BNG project actually look like? What do I have to do on the ground? What habitats would score highly? Ideally, I'd say you should turn this question around if you can and think first about what you would like to do on your farm or on your land holding. What fits with your land, what fits with your business, what's your skill set, what equipment do you have? And if you approach it in that way, then you're minimizing risk and you're also potentially reducing the costs of the project as well. And it's more likely to be something that you can actually manage over that 30-year period. BNG does give you a lot of flexibility. So it's not like stewardship schemes where you get given a menu of options with a set price per hectare on each of them. But yeah, so it can be flexible to fit your situation. And that's something that we can help you with as well if you're looking to review your holding and identify areas that might be best suited to biodiversity net gain. And it's also checking that there aren't any restrictions on the land that might prevent you from entering into that kind of agreement. Once you have an idea of what areas might have potential for BNG, the first step would then be to get some ecological surveys done to tell you what the baseline is, what's there at the moment, and what the potential might be to deliver an uplift on those sites. So again, that information would inform your choice of what you're doing and where the design of your project. Perhaps the easiest way to kind of talk about the potential of BNG is to talk through a bit of a case study. So This is an example that's based on a real life site that we assessed for a client, but the figures have kind of been rounded off. So please don't kind of take them as gospel, because we have kind of adapted it slightly to make the case study. So the site was a 20-hectare arable site, and the plan is to do arable reversion to grassland. The grassland being created isn't anything particularly exciting in ecological terms. It's just what we would call modified grassland as a habitat, so that's just improved grassland from an agricultural perspective. But it would be in moderate condition. So the management that would be required on that site is likely to be something similar to the kind of low input grassland that you might have through a stewardship scheme. So it could be grazed, you might be able to take a cut of it, but there'd be no artificial fertilizers, no sprays, careful management of grazing, and so on. And over that 30-year period, you'd likely to see an uplift of around 60 units for undertaking that change of management. So if we take those 60 units and look at the income that could be secured at a range of different prices, you can see we have gone for quite a big range here. The 20 to 25,000 pounds per unit is in line with some modelling that DEFRA have completed quite a few years ago. They have now said that they might even push that 25 to 30,000. The other end is a bit more pessimistic, as you can see. And we've completed some budgeting for this 30-year project as an example. That's taken into account agricultural income as well as BNG income. The costs that we've looked at would include obviously establishment of the new lay, general fixed costs such as labour and machinery, legal and professional fees, monitoring and reporting costs, although they've very much had to be an estimate at the moment, and any kind of ongoing management that might be required. Some key costs haven't been included, so the costs that have been excluded include tax, which is a little bit uncertain at the moment. The impact on the value of the land hasn't been taken into account, and any income foregone from the farm business also hasn't been included here. So you can see that with those additional factors, at the £10,000 per unit price point, you're maybe kind of starting to question this 30-year commitment a little bit. So these figures will continue to evolve. We'll continue to update them as we get more and more information about things like the monitoring costs and the market price as it starts to develop. But hopefully it's interesting just to see a rough estimate at this stage. Can I still farm? So again, this is a question we get asked a lot, and understandably so, because it's a very important consideration. It will, of course, have important implications for things like tax and succession. And the answer really comes down a lot to how ambitious you're going to be in your habitat management or restoration or creation project. Needless to say, it won't be business as usual. There will be changes that will need to be made, and that's part of BNG and meeting the rules around additionality that come into play with BNG as well. So you need to make changes in the management or land use in order to deliver the biodiversity net gain that you're looking for. And it has to be something that's over and above what you would normally do as part of your farm business. It's also important to note that the restrictions and prescriptions here must be followed for that 30-year period. Another question we get asked a lot is, how does biodiversity net gain interact with countryside stewardship? And this came through with some of the questions that were posed when you registered as well. Can you do both? Well, DEFRA have said that public funding can be used to prepare for BNG. So if you were to secure funding for baseline surveys, for example, then that wouldn't be an issue. If the land is in an agreement already, your BNG actions have to go above and beyond your stewardship requirements and deliver additional biodiversity gains in order for you to be able to look at BNG on that same land. Or it could be otherwise kind of specifically defined as separate to your CS work in some way. So it might be geographically separate, but the rest of the farm is in an agreement, or it could be very specific actions that you're looking at for BNG that, as I say, go over and above your stewardship. So the principle really is to avoid double funding. When you've identified your BNG project, you could either choose to sell your units at the start of the project which would be based on the gains that you think you'll be able to deliver over the 30-year period. Or you can start work and deliver the project and then sell the units later down the line when you have already completed some or all of the work that's required. And that would be called habitat banking. So that's the position of when you've actually started some of the work, maybe delivered some of the gain before you're looking to sell. Some companies have been set up, such as the Environment Bank, that are making a business out of creating habitat banks through agreements with farmers and landowners. And the way that tends to work is that they take out a long-term tenancy over the land, and they are then responsible for delivering the BNG units and marketing those and securing the sales. So there are some benefits to this approach in that it does significantly reduce the risk that you'd be taking on. You don't have to find a buyer yourself or negotiate a price, but it will also likely reduce the financial return that you'll see as a result of that project. If you don't decide to go via a habitat bank, how do you go about selling your units? Well, you might be fortunate enough to have direct ties to development. So that might be through development that's happening on your land or on an adjacent holding. You might even get direct approaches from a developer. There are online platforms springing up which can help to bring buyers and sellers together. Or you could look to work with a broker or an agent such as GSC Grace. We are offering a comprehensive BNG service that will take you right through from the point of identifying your site and doing your ecological surveys through to marketing and right through to kind of negotiating a sale. We can then also support with project implementation as well, if that's required, and reporting requirements and so on. The service we offer is very much rooted in our experience and our understanding of the commercial realities of what it takes to kind of run a farm or an estate, and also the importance of making sure that these projects do align with your long-term strategy, as we said at the beginning. So that's everything from me. I will hand over now to Josie, who's going to give us some insight into the legal side of BNG.
Thanks very much, Holly. Can you hear me okay before I start rattling off? Thanks for the introduction, Holly. I'm a solicitor at Mitchell Moores, as Holly said, and we've got a specialist natural capital team, draw across expertise from lawyers across the firm with a range of specialisms because it touches lots of different elements. So planning lawyers, real estate and strategic land, tax, and then I come with a sort of agricultural land management hat because of my legal background. And we're advising clients on BNG deals and other ecosystem services arrangements. So I'm going to focus on the legal side for the next 10 minutes or so. So briefly, just to consider and flag the legislation, the BNG regime has come in via the Environment Act 2021, which has amended the Town and Country Planning Act. And it's under this statutory framework that every planning permission granted in England now since the 12th of February will be deemed to have been granted subject to a biodiversity gain condition, subject to a few limited exceptions. So it's a pre-commencement condition. Once planning permission has been granted, a biodiversity gain plan has to be submitted and approved by the local planning authority before commencement of the development can happen. And the focus this evening and on my talk is on BNG being secured off-site on other land beyond the development red line boundary, as Holly mentioned. So how does that happen? How are sites legally secured? I've set out on this slide a sort of a bit of a spider graph as to how it works, but in order to sell biodiversity units, landowners need to commit to creating and managing habitat for at least 30 years from completion of habitat creation. And that commitment is made under what DEF are referring to as a legal agreement. The legal agreement must be either a planning obligation, so that's a Section 106 agreement, entered into with the local planning authority, or alternatively a conservation covenant entered into with a responsible body. And the legal agreement will confirm the creation of the habitat, the land involved, and the resulting BNG credits it will deliver or generate. It will formally require and impose obligations for habitat to be created and then subsequently maintained for at least 30 years. And there's two distinct requirements and time periods there. The 30-year clock will start ticking once the habitat has been created. The agreement will impose obligations on the landowner to monitor the habitat and ensure that the outcomes are delivered, which is again a point that Holly has flagged. And all of this management and monitoring will be enshrined in the habitat management and monitoring plan that Holly mentioned, and that's one of the documents that will underpin the legal agreements. Now, the contract between a landowner and a developer in terms of the sale of credits is via a separate but very important document, which I'm referring to as the credit or unit purchase agreement. This is where the money would flow and the sale of credit occurs. The landowner enters into a credit purchase agreement with developer or developers, depending on how many units they have to sell, and those can then be used and allocated to a development site. But the contract with the developer is very much underwritten by the separate legal agreement, the 106 or the conservation covenant entered into with the local authority. So once the legal agreement's completed, an application then has to be made to add the sites and the units that it generates to the National Game Site Register. And in most cases, the person who needs to make the application will be the landowner. A timeline will need to be supplied of the works being undertaken to create the habitat and the subsequent maintenance, details given about the type, size and condition of each proposed habitat on the land parcel and the projected performance, so the units it will generate, and details of the development to which the relevant habitat enhancement works and units have been allocated are then supplied to the register as well. So you link it to particular developments or a particular development if it's a single one. So Holly asked me, sort of flagged some common frequently asked questions that they come across, and I've added a few of my own as well. So just running through some of the key things that crop up quite regularly. The first question is, when might you use a conservation covenant instead of a Section 106 agreement? Now, in theory, the two agreements are meant to be interchangeable, and the legislation envisages that both will be used for BNG. But unfortunately, conservation covenants haven't taken off yet. There's been a real lack of applicants to be responsible bodies, plus delays originally before that. So initially, at least, BNG will be secured via Section 106 agreements, which are already well known and a well-trodden path for planning authorities, although of course in slightly different contexts. The other point is that Section 106 agreements can only be used in a planning context, so that's fine for BNG as we're discussing this evening, but conservation covenants can be used in relation to any private arrangement for conservation purposes, so they've got much wider application, and therefore we might see them being used a lot more in future in relation to other ecosystem services. Now, the inspection and monitoring, who will do that? Essentially, it will be the counterparty to the Section 106 agreement or conservation covenant, so the local planning authority or the responsible body under the conservation covenant. But the legal agreement will impose reporting and monitoring obligations and monitoring fees on the landowner, as you would expect to see. So the LPA will be looking to cover their costs and for landowners to do some of the legwork for them. There will be provisions requiring updates and reports to be submitted at agreed intervals and monitoring fees paid, etc., to allow the local authority to keep track of what's going on. Now, the next question is what happens if I can't or don't deliver? Starting first with, if you don't deliver, the local planning authority will be entitled to take enforcement action. We expect the legal agreements to have step-in rights, so they can go on and do works or stop things happening if required, plus contractual rights to sue for breach of contract and damages, etc. If you sell the land, the legal obligation securing it as a BNG site will run with the land and bind future owners and occupiers. So both Section 106 agreements and conservation covenants encumber the title. So these arrangements can be enforced against successors during the 30+ year term. Now, if you can't deliver, which is potentially a slightly different question, perhaps because of climate change rather than a management failure, that's obviously a really important issue, and it's important to build into legal agreements force majeure provisions to protect landowners in that scenario if it's something entirely out of their control. And another key point, I think, is that the focus in the drafting and the obligation should be on inputs rather than outcomes. So if as a landowner you you've done what you said you would do in the approved management plan and you deliver on that, you have delivered your side of the bargain. And we'll need to make sure that there's scope in the legal documents for evolving management plans between the parties if, because of external factors, the management needs to change. And it's important to consider things like good faith clauses and clear objectives so that if needed, there's a pathway to renegotiate exactly what is being delivered on site if that is needed. Now, what happens at the end of the 30-year plus? There is no ongoing legal obligation at the end of the 30-year period, but of course, landowners will be left with a site with potentially mature habitat, which could provide an opportunity for rebasing and perhaps the provision of another environmental service sort of go again. There is a theoretical risk which people are a bit concerned about sites being designated in some way to protect the habitat. That may or may not happen, but you know that it's obviously a safe assumption that the site is unlikely to return to intensive agricultural use, or perhaps not to the same use as it originally had. Next question, how are payments structured? In our experience, we're seeing a lump sum payment from the developer to the landowner under that credit purchase agreement, usually with a portion of that paid as a deposit to secure the anticipated number of credits or type of credits that the developer requires. And then payment is then made in full at the points the credits are drawn down and allocated to the development site, allowing the developer to commence development. The developer can then walk away, having bought their credits and complied with their planning condition. The landowner is left with the money to improve or continue creating the habitat and to thereafter manage it. And the landowner will need to use that money to comply with the ongoing monitoring obligations and costs of that, as Holly has flagged. So you need to factor those into those sort of ongoing management obligations into the calculations and ensure that you can fund it moving forward for the whole term. What happens if the developer goes bust? If they've already paid for the credits, obviously there's no issue. The long-term obligations here, once the credits have been purchased, are between the habitat site landowner and the local planning authority. Now, in terms of the risk of an intended developer purchaser going bust before the credit purchase completes, again, it's about legal drafting, making sure that the agreement provides for termination in the event of insolvency, so the landowner is free to market and sell the credits elsewhere. And you would expect, of course, any deposit paid by the developer to be forfeited and retained by the landowner in that scenario. Then on to the tax. I'm just going to touch briefly on that. It's not my specialism, just to get my disclaimer in early. I'm not a tax lawyer, but thankfully I have a number of colleagues around the firm who are very much across the detail and have been tracking and considering this for a considerable period of time. So thanks to them for the content of this little section, in particular Yuan Williams. I mean, the main headline is that the taxation landscape is really uncertain at the moment. There's a lack of legislation and guidance governing taxation on BNG and more generally natural capital and ecosystem services. We have been promised an update in relation to the government's consultation on the taxation of environmental schemes in the spring. I've seen correspondence today to suggest that that still is on track for an update, but exactly what that will, how much information we'll get and what will be proposed is still very unclear. So in the meantime, there's three key areas to consider: agricultural property relief and business property relief in the context of inheritance tax, and then also the taxation of the actual payments received by landowners under BNG agreements. So starting with the inheritance tax, there's a nervousness around the availability of agricultural property relief, so APR, because on the face of it, if land is taken out of agricultural use to create habitat, then APR could cease to apply to the value of the land, and the landowner could potentially face a 40% charge of that land value on death. And the problem here is the definition of agriculture for tax purposes as the legislation is currently drafted, because it's focused on food production and so not on dealing with these sort of new environmental or BNG opportunities. We're really hoping the Treasury will legislate to specify that land entered into BNG schemes or other environmental schemes will be deemed to constitute agricultural property. But as I say, it's watch this space. So in the meantime, it's about carefully considering whether the activities required for BNG could operate alongside agricultural usage so as to preserve APR. For example, a habitat which includes a level of husbandry, sort of in the example that Holly mentioned earlier, And it will also vary from landowner to landowner in terms of how important the APR position is for them and their overall planning. Alternatively, business property relief might be available in an inheritance tax context, but again, we're really lacking in any guidance from the revenue as to whether the activities of designing, creating, implementing and managing a BNG scheme will be deemed to be trading activities for BPR purposes. So turning to sort of consider the payments received under a BNG deal and their tax treatment. So if you enter into an agreement with a developer, the creation of the habitat is likely to be split into the initial capital establishment costs and then the ongoing management and maintenance over the lifetime of the agreement, for which the landowner will receive a lump sum on day one, in the example I mentioned earlier. Now that would appear to be a capital receipt, so you'd expect it to be subject to CGT. But there is an argument to say that that payment is a receipt for providing a service over a significant number of years. So at least a part of it should be taxed perhaps as income spread over the full period, enabling landowners to their ongoing management expenses for the duration to be offset against the income. But that is another area that's uncertain. So it's about looking at exactly what's being paid, when, and in return for what, and sort of going back to basic principles as it stands currently. Finally, just on VAT, we're currently working on the basis that the sale of units will be a supply for VAT purposes, with VAT payable at the standard prevailing rate. But again, HMRC are yet to formally decide. There's been some indications, but it's up in the air. So just the last couple of points from me. The next question was the position of tenant farmers and whether you can sign up to a BNG project if you're a tenant. The answer is that it depends on the terms of your tenancy agreement, but I think it is really very unlikely that agricultural tenants will be able to do it without landlord cooperation and consent. There might be a very small minority. Tenants who've got fixed term farm business tenancies who have more than the required 30 years left to run, in theory have the legal standing to enter a conservation covenant, but the terms of their tenancy might prevent them from doing that without landlord's prior consent. And some examples of the common tenancy terms that would be restrictive in a BNG context are set out on the slide. Now, Agricultural Holdings Act tenants, so people with older style agricultural tenancies, don't have the legal standing to enter into these long-term BNG or natural capital projects because they've only actually got a tenancy from year to year in a legal sense. Although they might be generational tenancies, they're actually only annual tenancies, meaning that they again don't have the legal standing to sign any of these agreements without landlords being a co-signatory. So I think collaboration is going to be really key across the tenanted sector to unlock BNG and other opportunities, and I really hope we will start to see that happening. So just a couple of final thoughts. Due diligence is just one thing. Holly's already flagged, the long-term nature of this and the sorts of things you need to consider. At a really early stage, you also need to consider any third-party interests or rights that might affect the land and the proposals. So mortgages, existing tenancies, reserved minerals or sporting rights, way leaves. You can't override any of those, so you need to ensure that the proposals are consistent with them or that they are dealt with and cleared off the title in advance or consent obtained, etc. And you need to ensure that you've got well-drafted legal agreements in place to ensure that the arrangements are robust and that you're protected and that thought has been given to the length of term and the sorts of issues that might crop up, some of which I've flagged tonight. But I think there are huge opportunities there, and if you're thinking about doing something like this on your holding or farm, BNG could be a great way to fund it. It's one of a few emerging natural capital markets. There are others out there, and I'm sort of seeing it as a new form of diversification for the sector. We're well used to diversified income streams, and sort of seeing it as another tool and another opportunity for other income streams. So thanks very much for the time and for listening. I'm going to hand over to Heather Overhead from Lichfields now, who's going to talk about BNG from a planning point of view. Many thanks.
Thank you, Josie, and hope you can all hear me okay. Just as a brief introduction, I'm joining with my colleague Anthony Greeley. We work at Lichfields, which is a national planning consultancy, and we represent clients who work in all sectors of the development industry. I head up the company's BNG internal BNG group and have been advising clients and colleagues on all matters relating to BNG for a couple of years now while the system's been developing. And Anthony and I have worked with DEFRA to try and get the system in as good a shape as possible. I'm going to be, as Josie said, I'm going to be looking at BNG from the planning system perspective and the challenges that it's going to present to the development industry. Unusually for a planning requirement, it's introduced by way of regulations rather than as a policy requirement, and this means that it's a fairly rigid system with a real lack of flexibility, which is one of the challenges I'll come on to. So the way it's introduced, as Holly mentioned, is by way of the imposition of a planning condition, and this will be imposed upon all relevant planning permissions, which ultimately will be the vast majority of planning permissions, and it will require developers to deliver a 10% net gain in biodiversity, which numerically means delivering 110% of the baseline biodiversity value at the end of the development. And the planning condition will be such that developers won't be able to make a start on their development until they have demonstrated how they will deliver the 10% net gain and committed to that. And the way that they'll demonstrate that is through submitting a biodiversity gain plan. And within that plan, you'll have to demonstrate how the 10% is delivered, and that will be a combination of delivery on site through habitat enhancements and new habitats, and then delivery off-site through biodiversity units in the off-site market, which is what we're talking about here. And then also, as Holly mentioned, there are government statutory biodiversity credits that you'll be able to purchase if you're unable to deliver through on and off-site. And I think this has already been covered, but any off-site units used to discharge the planning condition need to be on the Natural England Biodiversity Gain Site Register before you can even apply to discharge the planning condition and allocated to the development in question. So the biodiversity net gain condition will be on all relevant planning permissions, but it's relevant to note that there are some exemptions, most notably for this audience, I think, permitted development under agricultural PD rights and other types of PD rights will not be subject to the biodiversity net gain condition. There's an exemption for developments that have a very minor impact on habitats, and then there is also an exemption for planning applications for biodiversity gain sites. Development involved in creating biodiversity gain sites won't be subject to that requirement themselves. And we've included here our BNG flowchart that tells you whether a specific development needs to meet the BNG requirements. We're just including this for information purposes, really. I'm not going to run through it in detail, but aware that a lot of you as landowners will be undertaking developments yourself, so it's worth following this through. And as you follow it through, you will see that it's going to catch pretty much all planning permissions from the commencement dates. So the demand for BNG units is going to be, we think, really significant. Okay, so turning now to the key challenges facing developers with the introduction of this new requirement. And the first one really is viability. As I mentioned earlier, it's introduced through regulations, and there's a complete lack of flexibility in the system. So if you can't meet the 10% BNG requirement, you simply can't build your development. There's no way of negotiating the requirement down or negotiating it away because it's making a development unviable. But it's also going to create issues in terms of viability from providing biodiversity on site, because obviously that will lead to a loss of developable area. So it's a bit of a game changer, really, and some developments are going to incur quite high costs. Then we have another challenge of finding units. So at the moment, the Biodiversity Gain Site Register doesn't have any biodiversity gain sites registered on it. So anybody looking to try and solve an off-site problem right now is going to be in a slightly difficult position. But we're hoping that will change fairly soon. There must be some going through the application process. But again, you know, we're in really early days of this system, and so trying to find developers to match up with landowners to try and find units that can meet the demand there is certainly a difficulty we're facing at the moment. Another challenge is delays. There could be delays through the determination of the planning application, depending on what the local authority are asking for. But then there's an obvious delay of this planning condition can't start on site until it's been discharged. And if that's going to take time because off-site units need to be registered on the National Register, then that's another source of potential serious delay for developers. And then finally, uncertainty. As you know, this is a really new system. The approach from local authorities is untested under the mandatory system, and just there's uncertainty in terms of cost, there's uncertainty in terms of availability, and so that is just leading to some hesitancy around this in the development industry at the moment. So moving on to operating in the off-site biodiversity net gain market and things that we think you need to be aware of if that's something you're considering. First thing to be thinking about is to find an ecologist who understands the biodiversity metric. They will be able to then understand the potential opportunities that are present in your land holdings and where you might want to focus any habitat enhancements, and they'll be able to give you advice about the types of habitat that you might think about creating. The biodiversity metric has quite strict rules in it, which means that not all habitat types are equal. They have different values, and the more distinctive habitats have to be compensated for through like-for-like compensation. And so developers will be looking for different types of habitat units as well as just volume. And there are also multipliers within the metric that affect the value of units. So the further away it is from the development site, the less that unit is valued in the metric. So that's just something to be aware of if you're partnering up with developers. So as we've already mentioned, any BNG units in the offsite market have to be on the Natural England Register, and they have to be allocated to a development in order for the biodiversity game plan to be submitted. In order to get onto the register, they need to be secured with a legal agreement for 30 years and have a habitat management and maintenance plan attached to them. So that's quite a big undertaking. Then you'll need to consider finding a buyer, which I know Holly touched on quite a bit in her presentation towards the end there. But you may want to think about liaising with a single developer and whether you can provide units to meet their needs individually, or whether you want to create units more speculatively to sell on the open market. And then touching on something Josie talked about as well is what happens at the end of the 30-year period. Whilst it wouldn't in principle stop other uses of the land, it would certainly make it more difficult. You're going to have a site that's more valuable in terms of biodiversity. And if the BNG system is still in place in 30 years, then you know the requirement is going to be a lot higher for that site. There are other nature markets that might be available, and also it may well be possible to make further enhancements to habitats from which you can sell more BNG units going forward. I'm going to pass over now to Anthony, who's just going to talk about what the development industry needs.
Yes, thanks, Heather. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, good. Just to bring everything together, what Heather's said really, and just to give a developer's perspective on the new mandatory system. As Heather says, we advise across all different sectors, development sectors, advising commercial and industrial developers, landowners, public authorities, utility companies, house builders. A number of the clients that we've been speaking to over the last 12 months or so are on the screen there, some of our clients. It's fair to say they're all at different stages in terms of their understanding and their buy-in to the new BNG system. Some, such as Legal & General, McDonald's, very much have see BNG as part of their ESG commitments and their net zero targets. So they're very much ahead of the curve. They're looking to partner with landowners and find strategic solutions. Most investor-backed developers are now starting to factor in BNG commitments, BNG costs into their financial appraisals for developments. So there is an acceptance at first point, really. They're not looking to compromise their developments. So what I mean by that is they're not looking to reduce floor space, to increase red line boundaries, to take in more land necessarily. They do see compensatory provision off-site where meeting biodiversity net gain on-site is not viable. It is compensation off-site that they're looking to, as I say, rather than, in their eyes, compromising the development proposal that they're bringing forward. So the economic balance at the moment very much is to the development industry. It's very much cheaper to compensate off-site than sacrifice floor space or acquire more land to provide on-site mitigation and solutions. I say this probably, Guy, I'll let you speak for the residential sector separately. I think it is probably a different case in the residential sector, but certainly for commercial and industrial sectors, that's very much the approach they're taking. It's fair to say it's a settling down period that we're in. Developers continue to want some flexibility in the system, particularly timescales for the system to bed down. We've seen a raft of new legislation and secondary legislation and guidance in the last 3 months. So the system is still very much to bed down, and developers are looking for that time period to allow the system to bed down. Crucially, though, the system is here. It's mandatory now on most forms of development, as we've said. So developers do have to find solutions, and they are now locked in. Local authorities will not grant endless timescales for the delivery of BNG. So very much it does focus the developers' minds on engaging with landowners and engaging in off-site opportunities to fulfill their net gain requirements. I think overall, where it comes down to, as well as greater certainty in the system, greater certainty around costs, is probably very much around mutual assurance that landowners understand that developers now, there are significant demands on the development industry brought about through the mandatory system, which is going to inevitably lead them to find those off-site solutions and need to find those off-site solutions. And probably what comes back with that is landowners having the confidence to take the steps to appraise and evaluate the opportunities on their land holdings, to move towards registering land on the National Register. Once those two elements come together, and the sooner that local markets are established, and there's a common understanding of costs in local markets as opposed to the costs of the national statutory credit, the sooner that's worked through, and the sooner that land is put onto the National Register and true local market costs are understood, and the sooner the system will essentially gather momentum and the wheels of the system will be turning. Thanks, Holly.
That's great, thank you very much. And then last but definitely not least, we've got Guy from Taylor Wimpey.
Hi there. Yeah, so I'm Guy from Taylor Wimpey, as Ollie said. I'm in the strategic land team, so we essentially specialise in taking land that doesn't have any residential designation through to allocation for residential and then planning permission thereafter. Conscious of time, so I will just try and whiz through this really. I sit on the BNG working group, so we've been engaging with DEFRA and Natural England for quite a while now. I think as a company, I mean, sorry, I've forgotten Heather's number two's name, but as a company, I think it really is it's an opportunity for us, and it's more than suppose it's a commercial decision as much as anything. It really does help us create places, more attractive, healthier places that ultimately our customers want. I think one of the things that we are grappling with and just kind of trying to work with our customers is kind of the new look that it will be. So you can see the picture of our environment strategy. That picture, although the kind of wildflower meadow looks lovely now, in the summer, I think throughout the year it might start to look different. So just kind of educating customers and taking them on the journey really with us. It's not the classic sort of manicured green lawns that we're all used to seeing. But in terms of our solutions, I suppose we don't have any large national BNG sites at the moment, so we are working on a site-by-site basis, which I think is probably helpful from your guys' perspective, really, in that we are, as we identify the need for BNG sites, we are working with landowners directly and structuring agreements to suit their needs and our needs, really, and working through in that way. If you go to the next slide, please, Holly. So yeah, just a quick example. This is a scheme that that we've been working on. So you can see the layout there in the top right. The first thing we'll go on is we'll go onto the site. We'll send an ecologist on. They'll survey the site. And the most important thing is just to understand the baseline, like some of the other speakers have spoken about, and that will influence the design. And ultimately, we'll use that to avoid the areas with the high baseline areas, and hopefully try and achieve 10% on site. And we'll map that like we do with all of the other constraints that we map, so whether that be drainage or overhead power lines or whatever, we will map the BNG so that it can feed through into how we lay out the scheme. And then the scheme categories, so habitat, hedgerows and rivers, and we've got to achieve 10% on each of those. Habitats we're finding typically can be okay, depending on the baseline of the site. Hedgerows, we're normally able to achieve 10% on site, so we're not usually looking for hedgerow units. Rivers can be a real headache, so they are, if we need river units, then I think currently they're hard to achieve and they're expensive, so it's potentially a good opportunity there if landowners do have rivers. I think for us, as much as anything, as well as looking at the final BNG scheme, we need to understand how the scheme is going to be delivered and the build out process. So you can see the plan in the bottom right. The area that's shaded red is the area where the habitat's going to be lost, and the area that's shaded green is where we're retaining the habitat and improving it. So if you compare that to the layout in the top right there, you can see that it looks as though, at first kind of glance, that there's actually more area that's retained as green, the habitat that's retained, sorry, south of the kind of main road. But that area will actually be lost through kind of earthworks and other processes throughout the build process, and then it will have to be re-provided. And ultimately, the number of units that are created through the new habitat are less than if the habitat was retained and improved, if we were to compare like for like same habitats. So if we are, so it's just really important for us to understand how the scheme is going to be built out and really carefully implemented, because if we make a mistake there, we can potentially find ourselves in a position where we're not achieving as many units as we were hoping, and potentially we're then not able to comply with our planning permission. If you are lucky enough to have some development land, I think a key takeaway really is just that landowners need to carry on managing the land as they have been up until the point at which they sell the land, because I think if you think, oh, it's going to be sold for development, and you kind of let it go and stop managing it, then that can create issues for BNG, because basically the baseline increases a lot. Yeah, Holly, go to the next slide, please. And then just quickly, so if we do find ourselves in a position where the development site we've just looked at, we can't achieve 10% on site, got to go off site, like a lot of what we've been talking about today. We'll go on to site, we will or ecologists will go on our behalf. They will survey the site and create a plan like the one on the screen there, which will map out the habitats, and then from that we can work out how many units we can create. So we will have to satisfy the trading rules, which we've touched on, but essentially it may be that we have to find specific habitat unit types depending on the ones that we're losing. Again, Josie touched on it really, but I think we will always be really keen to understand the legal constraints, and in particular things like if there's a pipeline on the site, what the easement looks like. And I think utilities companies will often have the right to dig the pipe up, and they will have to reinstate it. But at the time that those kind of agreements were in place, nobody envisaged BNG, so they won't necessarily have to reinstate it to a point to recreate the units that you've lost, or we've lost. So it's just understanding probably the standoff from that, and not creating units above those things where ultimately you might find yourself, you've sold the units and then you lose them if there is something that's out of your control. Just whiz through these. So we will structure the agreement off really through discussion with the landowner. So we'll look at buying the land freehold, potentially taking a lease on it for 30 or 31 years. I've done one of those recently, or just buying the units directly from you if you were to implement it. Just, I think I would say approach developers early. If you're thinking about creating units, then often you won't really be aware of the schemes that they're thinking about submitting planning applications on. And often by the time they do submit the planning application, they'll already have the BNG solution, so it's a bit late at that point. So I think speak to Holly or whoever it might be, and start to approach developers early. And just final point, if you are to implement the unit, if you are to implement the scheme, sorry, the earlier you do it, ultimately the more units you create. So if you are to implement the BNG scheme early, then you will result in more units. So yeah, there you go. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll just stop sharing our screens just so that everybody can see us. And we have had some questions come through. So first question that came actually when somebody registered was, are national parks excluded from BNG? Which is a good question, because obviously national parks can have different approach to planning and so on than other areas, but they're not excluded from BNG. And I think it's also important to add on that if your site's designated in terms of SSSIs or SACs and so on, then you could potentially still look at BNG, but it's important that you're still meeting those additionality requirements. So your project is still going over and above what you would otherwise be legally required to do as a result of managing that land. So yeah, there can be additional considerations if your site is designated, but it's not impossible that you could still look at undertaking BNG on that area. Another question that came in on registrations was, would you recommend large-scale diverse biodiversity creation or more single action point projects on multiple land parcels? Anthony, could I go to you first on that one in terms of whether it's better to look at a kind of single large-scale project or multiple smaller projects?
Yeah, sure, Holly. Yeah, thanks. Certainly through the engagement we've had with DEFRA over the last 2 years or so, there's been a significant call for strategic sites and strategic solutions to be identified, where multiple that offer multiple solutions for multiple developers, essentially to contribute towards perhaps more complex habitat types. the aim of the game is diversity. So by contributing towards those more complex opportunities, yes, that's certainly something that the development industry would welcome. It's probably more challenging in terms of agreeing that with local authorities, as there are time implications quite often linked to the establishment of more complex habitats, and therefore a greater reliance upon time and for those commitments of those individual developers to come to fruition. So a greater lead-in time, greater monitoring ask, and therefore it may be that in certain instances it is perhaps seen as more favourable to deliver quicker solutions, free the developer of the obligation, deliver it soon, recognise it, and everybody moves on. Personally, I don't think that's the right approach, because as I say, it's not going to provide the country with what ultimately this is about, which is a greater diversity of habitats and really tackle some of those more complex opportunities. So yeah, strategic sites definitely should be the focus.
Thanks very much. Josie, did you want to come in on that one at all from the point of view of the legal agreements that might be required? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, still muted. I think it's about sort of considering the cost and the commerciality if you're doing multiple smaller sites. The number of agreements, etc., that might need to be put in place to achieve that would be a consideration for all parties, really. But as Anthony said, you know, if you're looking for a diversity of units and you've got the ability to create a larger site that offers a range of options, then that could be really a really positive and really marketable offering.
Thanks.
I was just going to say, Holly, that probably what it also comes down to is the individual developer. If you have a national developer, take McDonald's for example, it would be much more simple to enter one legal agreement on one strategic solution to serve their national development requirements. It's probably different for different size developers, different requirements of those organisations, but certainly there is a place for strategic solutions in that sense as well.
Mm-hmm. And guys, is land acquisition something that you're looking at all in terms of providing a solution? Just thinking, if you're looking at a larger scale site that could deliver over a number of different projects potentially for you, you know, would that be something that you're potentially looking at acquiring those types of sites as well?
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, I mean, in terms of the actual acquisition, we often talk to landowners about different ways of structuring the agreement, whatever kind of often is their preference. But I think one thing we are coming up against, and which is a potential issue with the largest strategic sites, is local authorities saying to us that they basically want the solution to be as close as possible to the actual development. So not just within the local or the council area, but actually saying that your proposed BNG solution isn't going to benefit the residents that are losing out from this green space going. So we want you to demonstrate that you've exhausted all of the other nearby options. So although a strategic solution is potentially the best for biodiversity and the nature, and cost even potentially, I think that there is that, I suppose, extra consideration.
Is that something that I think we've got a couple of people on from different local planning authorities? I don't want to put you on the spot too completely, but if anybody wants to jump in on these questions, then please feel free to. You should be able to unmute yourself. Stuart, I can see you've got your hand up. I think you're on mute still, Stuart.
Is that working, King?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Hey, absolutely brilliant. So it's a new system. My mouse is tracking all over the place. Yeah, I'm Stuart Priest. I work for Durham County Council. A couple of points. Yes, that local delivery, there is that political push through the planning process locally. But obviously, the biodiversity net gain is supposed to be all about strategic delivery. And I think what hasn't really come up yet is the fact that within the metric, if you deliver within an identified strategic area, you get an uplift in the number of points you are getting per hectare of delivery, essentially. So that's worth bearing in mind, because those strategic locations will be determined by the local nature recovery strategy mapping, which is not yet live and will probably not be live for most places for another 12 months at least. But in terms of trying to maximize your bang for your buck for your units as somebody who's trying to sell units, you need to be aware of that LNRS process and be feeding into that process where you see opportunities that are deliverable and practical. So yeah, the two are all linked, you know. So I think BNG and the local nature strategy are partners, and I think you need to be aware of both when you start to look at land holdings. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Thank you for raising it, Stuart. And we've actually had another question about local nature recovery strategies, which is, will the local nature recovery strategy strategic significance multiplier for the BNG metric deter developers from choosing a site for development? So this is if a site has been identified within the local nature recovery strategy, then the biodiversity value of that site is multiplied within the metric. So there's an uplift of 15%, I think, on that original baseline value that would have been had it not been identified. So that's, as Stuart pointed out, that's an advantage for landowners who are potentially looking to do a habitat creation or restoration project on the site and then sell units, but it's potentially a disadvantage for developers who might be looking to develop that land. Guy, could I go to you first on that one, please?
Yeah, sure. I think the truth of it is no. It's so hard to get planning permission on sites now that if, or even a residential allocation, if it is allocated for housing or there's a planning permission, then I mean, I suppose it's a factor and it's something, a cost that will have to be factored into the land value at the end of the day. But we would still pursue it, even if it was within the area where the multiplier was applied.
Heather or Anthony, do you have anything else to add on that?
I was just going to say that because the local nature recovery strategies are going to be delivered not by single local authorities, but by groups of local authorities, you would hope that in time, sort of residential allocations for residential sites wouldn't clash with local nature recovery strategies, because you'd hope that they would be in alignment. It would certainly probably play against you for an unallocated site if it was sort of allocated in some way or designated in a local nature recovery strategy. So in terms of that planning balance, sort of regardless of BNG, it would probably be harder to get planning permission on a site that's got a designation through a local nature recovery strategy. Obviously, if there's a residential allocation as well, then that changes that slightly.
We've had a question here about pre-existing habitats, and a couple of things have come through along similar lines, which is, you know, considering that biodiversity net gain is obviously looking for an uplift in biodiversity value, does that mean that if you've already done a lot of work through Countryside Stewardship, for example, or you have pre-existing habitats, are you disadvantaged? I think this is a really interesting question. In some cases, there may be a disadvantage to having already restored habitats if you're looking at BNG, because there might be less opportunity to deliver that uplift. However, there will be lots of other situations in which that might have stood you in better stead. So if you're looking at public funding schemes, for example, then having those higher value habitats on your site is likely to kind of stand you in better stead from the public agri-environment scheme point of view. Also, and I'll open this out in a minute because I'd be interested in the panel's opinions, but in my view, having a track record of having already delivered habitat projects on your land would be better than being somebody who's coming completely fresh to these types of projects, who has nothing to show for whether or not they're able to deliver and no previous experience of doing that. So if you're able to show that that's been a key part of your business and land management over a long period of time, then to my mind, you're kind of a safer pair of hands than if you didn't have that track record. But yeah, I'm interested in anybody from the panel if you have any opinions on that take on it.
It would certainly seem an appropriate starting point. I think one of the big challenges around the new system is resource to monitor the delivery of habitat enhancements. That's going to rest with local authorities primarily, and therefore if there are landowners who are routinely delivering and have a reputation for delivery of enhancements, then yeah, that would help. I think with certainly tackling that resource challenge.
Mm-hmm. You can also still deliver gains on, even if you already have valuable habitats, often there's still improvements in condition that you can make. I think it's very rare that you'll have got to the point where you can't do anything more. So it's still worth considering whether an uplifting condition of an existing habitat, sometimes that actually can score better on the metric than creating something from scratch. So yeah, there's pros and cons, but I think it's definitely still worth considering.
Yeah, I would just echo that, Holly, and just say I think it would be really important in that situation to get some advice from ecologists, because they're the professionals that understand the metric and the workings of the metric best, and how easy or difficult it is to enhance habitats and how long it takes, and that all feeds into the scoring metric. So I wouldn't say it's a no-go. That's when it starts.
Thank you. We had a question about monitoring procedures and also the costs of monitoring over the course of the project. Josie, I wondered whether I could come to you in terms of the monitoring procedures and how they are stipulated, because my understanding is that that's something that could vary quite a bit between different agreements.
Yeah, it's something that my understanding is the regulations don't see a huge amount. They just make it very clear that there needs to be monitoring covered in the legal agreements. So we're expecting it to vary significantly from local authority. And sort of on my desk at the moment, I was looking in the context of a nutrient deal. For example, I've got 2 nutrient deals where one local authority was very hot and put in monitoring requirements. That was requirements to submit reports at specified intervals that reflected the type of habitat being created. So it kind of the intervals got less as the term went on, and to pay a fee each time. Another local authority didn't put anything in at all. So I think it will be interesting to see how that turns out in practice. But it's very clear that that responsibility will fall on the landowner or the habitat manager in the first instance, and their costs and obligations that need to be factored in when looking at the overall commerciality of your scheme. It'd be interesting if anybody else on the webinar has got anything to add on that in terms of the sorts of monitoring that they're going to be requiring.
I'd imagine it's something as well that's likely to vary quite a bit between different habitat types in terms of what level of monitoring might be needed. Tim Birkinshaw, I can see you've got your hand up. Do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm Tim. I work at North Yorkshire Council, so I can give a planning authority perspective. I think this question of monitoring is a really sort of hot topic. It's something that I think has sort of come to the attention of BNG people in the planning authorities rather later in the day, because we've been sort of trying to get our heads around how does the actual development management process work, and when are the regs coming out, etc. So it's been rather kind of late in the day. But some of the authorities that have been, those sort of the trailblazers, like Buckinghamshire, for example, have done a lot more thinking about this and come up with, not only a proposal that they are going to charge fees for monitoring those legal agreements, policing effectively, but also come up with ways to calculate them. And so we've tried to emulate the Buckinghamshire calculates, basically a spreadsheet that looks at a range of monitoring occasions when we expect to see a report from the site manager, you know, with photographs or evidence or, you know, ecological survey data saying, you know, we promised we'd send you a report after 1 year, after 3 years, after 5 years, etc., all the way up to 30, so that we can specify right up front in the Section 106 agreement with that site manager, this is when we expect you to show us evidence of your site monitoring, and also this is what we will charge for it. And I think a few planning authorities have looked at charging per monitoring event, you know, so that a report is submitted and they charge a fee at that point. But most of the ones that I'm aware of are looking at a single lump sum fee at the start that is sort of index linked with an anticipated figure for inflation, so that we can say, right, if you pay us this amount when we sign the agreement, we will bank that, and that will cover the cost of our officers, our ecologists, you know, kind of looking over your shoulder at these regular intervals over the 30 years, and reviewing the reports that you send to us. So in North Yorkshire, we've tried to do that, and we've set up a kind of fees calculator that looks at 3 different size categories of the area of the habitat, and 3 different technical difficulty categories, which basically mirror what's in the metric, so that we can basically say, you know, there's a kind of scale of 9 prices, starting from the, you know, the smaller and simpler sites up to the larger and more complex sites. But I think this is something that's going to evolve and change. I think there are plenty of planning authorities who haven't yet thought about this, and plenty others who are now realizing actually we need to figure out how to charge a fee, and we need to sort of push through a political decision through the council, which might take, you know, weeks or months, to get permission to charge a new fee, because it's a new thing. So, you know, I'm glad that we managed to go through it, start the process back in the autumn. It wasn't until end of January we finally got it signed off. Yeah, and equally, if somebody's using their land as a habitat bank and intending to sell units, they will need to know from the planning authority in whose area they reside what those monitoring fees are going to be, because they're factoring that into the cost of the units. Not only are they saying, how much will I spend on, you know, machinery costs and labor costs and seed costs, establishing the habitats, managing them over 30 years, paying the ecologist who's going to come and do the surveys. But then when I submit those reports to the planning authority, who is, you know, the other party in the legal agreement, am I going to have to pay them a fee as well? Now, I imagine that's small beer compared to the costs of the management and the ecologist who's doing the survey in the field, but they do need to know what the planning authority or the responsible body is going to command from them as a fee.
That's really helpful, thank you. And I think, as you say, that having as much clarity up front as possible is really key to a lot of this, both from the point of view of the landowners and from the developer's perspective as well. The more certainty we can get earlier on, it'll give people greater confidence to kind of enter this market, and also greater confidence that they can actually deliver against the agreements that are being put forwards. That's great, thank you. I think we've covered most of the questions that have come in. Does anybody else want to pose any last burning questions before we wrap up? Or are there any questions that the panel would like to put forwards? No? Well, thank you all very much for your contributions this evening. I hope you'll all agree it was a really interesting set of presentations, and great to have some different perspectives on what's quite a complicated and still very much emerging area at the moment. If anybody has any questions following up from the webinar this evening, then please do get in contact with us, and we'll be sharing around a recording as well. So if you know anybody that wanted to attend but couldn't make it along, then please let them know that they'll be able to access a recording from this evening. Thank you all very much, and hopefully we will be able to have another instalment soon to give you an update on how the market's developing later in the year. Thank you.
Thanks very much.